I never expected to own a nursing home at age 68. But when my children abandoned me at Pinewood Acres, a facility with peeling wallpaper and the persistent smell of disinfectant, they couldn't have known about my silent fortune. The $7 million I'd secretly accumulated over decades would transform both the neglectful institution and the family who thought they'd written the final chapter of my story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain tapped against the car window as my son David drove me to what he called my new home. I'd been living independently in my own house for 8 years since my husband Richard passed away, managing quite well despite the arthritis that occasionally flared in my hands and knees. At least that's what I thought. "Mom, this is the best solution for everyone," David said, his eyes never leaving the road. "The house is too much for you to maintain, and after your fall last month we can't risk you being alone anymore." My fall had been nothing more than a momentary loss of balance while watering the plants on my patio. I'd called Sarah, my daughter, simply because I'd skinned my elbow and needed advice on whether to use the antibiotic ointment or just soap and water. Somehow, that minor incident had transformed into a family crisis, complete with concerned phone calls and urgent discussions about my deteriorating condition. "I'm perfectly capable of living on my own," I replied, trying to keep the edge from my voice. "If maintenance is the concern, I can hire someone to help with the yard and heavier cleaning." "We've been over this, Mom," David sighed with the patronizing patience he'd perfected since becoming a corporate executive. "Sarah and I both live too far away to check on you regularly. What if something serious happens?" What he didn't say, what neither of my children had the courage to articulate, was that my 3-bedroom home sat on nearly an acre of increasingly valuable suburban property that would eventually form part of their inheritance. Property that could be sold now, with the proceeds ostensibly funding my care, while conveniently eliminating the risk of me spending their future inheritance on actually enjoying my remaining years. The rain intensified as we turned onto a narrow access road. A sign appeared through the streaked windshield: Pinewood Acres Residential Care Facility. The name conjured images of a bucolic country retreat. The reality was a flat-roofed single-story building with institutional beige siding and windows that resembled those of a public elementary school constructed in the 1970s. "Here we are," David announced with manufactured cheerfulness. "They have everything you'll need. Medical staff on site, social activities, 3 meals a day." I remained silent as he parked near the entrance. My silence wasn't due to sadness or shock, though David likely interpreted it that way. I was calculating, assessing, planning my next move. Because there was something my children didn't know, something I'd kept carefully guarded for decades. Richard and I had never been wealthy in the traditional sense. He worked as an engineer for the state highway department while I taught 3rd grade at Westfield Elementary for 32 years. We lived modestly in the house we purchased as newlyweds, drove sensible cars, and took affordable vacations. But beneath this ordinary exterior lay an extraordinary secret. I had been systematically investing since my 20s. It began with an inheritance from my grandmother, a seemingly modest $18,000 that most would have spent on a car or home renovation. Instead, I invested in carefully researched stocks that grew steadily over decades. Rather than upgrading our lifestyle with each salary increase, I channeled additional funds into my private portfolio. Richard had known about my investing hobby, but never its true scale. We'd agreed early in our marriage to maintain some financial independence alongside our joint accounts. By the time Richard passed away, my personal portfolio had grown to $2 million, a fact I shared with absolutely no one, not even my children. In the 8 years since his death, strategic investments had increased that sum to approximately $7 million. My children, who had grown accustomed to seeing their parents live modestly, assumed I subsisted primarily on Richard's pension and my teacher's retirement. The truth would have astonished them. Their seemingly penny-pinching mother could afford luxury senior living anywhere in the country. Instead, they were escorting me to Pinewood Acres, a facility I'd researched after David first mentioned it. The place accepted Medicaid patients and had been cited twice in the past 3 years for staffing violations. Ms. Eleanor Parker, welcome to Pinewood Acres. The administrator's voice jarred me from my thoughts. She was a thin woman with an aggressively bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm Brenda Wilkins, Director of Resident Services. We're so happy to have you joining our family. The institutional odor hit me as we entered, a caustic blend of industrial cleaner, overcooked vegetables, and something underlying that spoke of neglect and surrender. Residents in various stages of decline sat in a common area, most staring vacantly at a television mounted high on the wall. The linoleum floors, though recently mopped, showed decades of wear. Paint peeled subtly at baseboards, and the ceiling, tiles bore yellowish water stains from past leaks. Let me show you to your room, Brenda continued, leading us down a corridor where the overhead fluorescent lights flickered intermittently. You'll be sharing with Mrs. Henderson. She's been with us for 3 years and is a delight, very quiet. The room confirmed my worst expectations, approximately 200 square feet divided by a thin curtain. On one side, an elderly woman dozed in a hospital-style bed. On my side waited a similar bed, a small pressboard dresser, and a single chair beside a narrow window overlooking the parking lot. The walls were bare except for a bulletin board with posted meal times and facility rules. Bathroom is shared, of course. Brenda indicated a door in the corner. There's a call button by each bed for emergencies. Meals are at 7:30, 11:30, and 5 Rs in the dining hall. Activities in the common area most afternoons. David began unloading the 2 suitcases that now contained what remained of my personal possessions. My furniture, books, family photographs, kitchen equipment, and the quilt my grandmother had made, all either sold, distributed to family members, or donated to charity. 68 years of accumulated life, reduced to 2 suitcases of clothing, and toiletries. This looks nice, David said, his hesitation betraying the lie. Don't you think, Mom? And look, you have a window. I sat on the edge of the bed, testing its thin mattress and squeaky frame. How thoughtful of them to include a window, I replied, allowing just enough sarcasm to make David shift uncomfortably. He checked his watch, an expensive timepiece I'd noticed earlier. I should probably get going soon. I have a conference call at 4, and with traffic. He trailed off, the unspoken message clear. Disposing of his mother was just one item on today's schedule, now efficiently completed. Sarah wanted to be here, he added, but Jamie has that soccer tournament in Westport this weekend. My granddaughter's soccer tournament naturally took precedence over helping relocate her grandmother to a substandard care facility. I nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Ms. Parker, we typically serve afternoon tea around 3. Brenda interjected, a nice opportunity to meet some of the other residents. I'm sure Mom will settle in quickly, David said, already moving toward E. The door. He bent to give me a perfunctory hug. I'll call tomorrow to see how you're doing. Sarah said she'll try to visit next weekend. After they departed, I sat motionless on the bed, listening to the building's ambient sounds. A television, too, loud in a distant room, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the rattling of meal carts being prepared for dinner service. My roommate continued sleeping, her breathing labored and occasionally interrupted by a concerning catch. I reached into my handbag, the one item I'd insisted on keeping with me rather than allowing David to unpack, and extracted my smartphone and a small notebook. Opening the notebook, I began making precise notes about everything I'd observed since arriving. Staffing levels, facility conditions, resident care standards, security measures. Next, I opened my banking app and, after confirming my identity with fingerprint authentication, transferred $50,000 from my investment account to my checking account. The transaction completed instantly, the screen showing a checking balance. That would have shocked my children. I then called a number I'd researched the previous night. "Silverman Legal Associates," answered a professional voice. "This is Eleanor Parker. I'd like to schedule a consultation with Marion Silverman as soon as possible. Tomorrow would be preferable." "Let me check Ms. Silverman's availability," the receptionist replied. After a brief pause, "She could see you at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Will that work?" "Perfectly. Please inform Ms. Silverman that I'll need expertise regarding real estate acquisition, specifically the purchase of an existing business." After ending the call, I opened my email and sent a message to Peter Harrison at Westbrook Financial Advisors, the firm that had been managing my investments since Richard's death. "Peter, please prepare liquidation options for approximately $2.5 million in assets, seeking maximum availability within 30 days while minimizing tax impact. Also, please research current market valuation and financial health of Pinewood Healthcare Holdings. We'll need comprehensive report for meeting later this week." As I pressed send, a smile spread slowly across my face. My children believed they had written the final chapter of my story, a convenient conclusion that freed them from obligation while securing their financial interests. They had no idea that I was actually beginning an entirely new chapter, one in which I would reclaim not just my autonomy, but perhaps something far more valuable: justice disguised as extraordinary success. When the call for afternoon tea sounded, I straightened my cardigan, smoothed my hair, and prepared to meet my fellow residents. I would need allies for what lay ahead, and I suspected many here had been similarly discarded by families who considered them burdens rather than treasures. We had much in common, these strangers and I, and together we might accomplish something remarkable. As I walked toward the common area, my mind was already architecting the transformation that would soon render Pinewood Acres unrecognizable, beginning with its ownership. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first night at Pinewood Acres confirmed my worst suspicions. Sleep proved elusive on the thin mattress with its plastic-covered pillow, but the insomnia provided an unexpected advantage: the opportunity to observe the facility's night operations. Between midnight and 6 a.m., I noted only 2 staff members responsible for all 48 residents. Call buttons went unanswered for up to 30 minutes. My roommate, Mrs. Henderson, received her medication 2 hours late, causing her to moan uncomfortably until the overworked night nurse finally appeared. By morning, I had compiled 3 pages of detailed notes documenting specific deficiencies in care standards, facility maintenance, and staffing levels. These observations would form the foundation of my discussion with attorney Marion Silverman, whom I planned to meet after breakfast. The dining hall presented another sobering reality. Breakfast consisted of lukewarm oatmeal with the consistency of wallpaper paste, accompanied by toast so hard it posed a genuine dental hazard. A small plastic cup held 4 ounces of orange juice so diluted it barely retained its color. The coffee tasted as if it had been brewed yesterday and reheated multiple times since. Most distressing was watching residents who needed assistance eating, being rushed through meals by staff clearly pressured to maintain rigid scheduling. "Been here long?" asked a gentleman at my table, his hands trembling slightly as he attempted to butter his toast. "Just arrived yesterday," I replied, carefully assessing him. Despite the institutional setting, he maintained a certain dignity, his white hair neatly combed, his shirt collar precisely arranged. "Eleanor Parker." "Robert Williams, 2 years in this establishment." He pronounced establishment with quiet irony. "Former high school principal, now primarily an observer of institutional inefficiency." Interesting perspective. I was a teacher for 32 years. His eyes brightened with recognition of a kindred spirit. "Then you'll appreciate the systematic failures here," classic case of profit maximization at the expense of those without advocacy. I glanced around to ensure no staff were within earshot. I'm gathering information on those systematic failures. Would you be willing to share your observations? Robert studied me with newfound interest. Most new residents focus solely on adjustment and acceptance. You appear to have a different agenda. Let's just say I don't accept unnecessary limitations, institutional or otherwise. A subtle smile crossed his face. In that case, Ms. Parker, I believe we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. The courtyard after breakfast? Staff rarely venture there, too busy managing emergencies created by their own understaffing. After arranging this meeting, I approached the nurses' station where a harried young woman was attempting to organize medication distribution while simultaneously answering a constantly ringing phone. "Excuse me," I began pleasantly. "I have an appointment in town this morning. Could you please let me know the procedure for leaving the facility temporarily?" The nurse, Jenny, according to her name badge, looked momentarily confused. "Leaving? You mean by yourself?" "Yes. I have legal matters to attend to." "I'm not sure. Let me check your file." She tapped at a computer keyboard, frowning slightly. "It doesn't specify any mobility restrictions, but most residents don't leave unaccompanied. There's a shuttle to the shopping center on Tuesdays. Maybe you could reschedule your appointment?" "That won't be necessary," I replied firmly. "I've arranged for a car service. I simply wanted to follow proper protocol." Jenny seemed uncertain how to respond to a resident demonstrating autonomy. "Well, I suppose you'll need to sign the log at reception. Make sure we have your cell number, in case of emergency." "Of course. Thank you for your assistance." 30 minutes later, I sat in the pristine offices of Silverman Legal Associates, directly across from Marion Silverman herself, a formidable woman in her 50s whose reputation as one of the region's top business attorneys had drawn me to her practice. "Ms. Parker, you mentioned interest in business acquisition, specifically a healthcare facility," she began after preliminary introductions. "Before we discuss that, I'd like to understand your background and objectives." For the next 15 minutes, I provided a concise overview of my financial position, sharing documentation from my portfolio, real estate holdings, and liquid assets. Marion's professional composure barely masked her surprise at the extent of my resources, a reaction I had grown accustomed to on the rare occasions I revealed my true financial status. "I see," she said, reviewing my portfolio statement. "And the facility you're interested in acquiring?" "Pinewood Acres Residential Care Facility, currently owned by Pinewood Healthcare Holdings, a subsidiary of Cornerstone Care Systems." I handed her my notebook containing the observations I'd compiled. "I've been a resident there for exactly 18 hours and have documented numerous violations of state regulations regarding elder care standards." Marion's eyebrows rose slightly as she scanned my notes. "These are concerning findings. May I ask why you're residing there, given your financial capacity to afford premium care options?" "My children arranged my placement without consulting me regarding alternatives. They believe my resources are limited to a teacher's pension and modest savings. I've allowed this misperception to continue for reasons that will become clear momentarily." I leaned forward, my voice lowering slightly. "I don't merely want to leave Pinewood Acres, Ms. Silverman. I intend to acquire it, transform it, and use it as the foundation for redefining standards in affordable elder care." Marion set down her pen, giving me her full attention. "That's an ambitious undertaking. What's your timeline?" "Immediate. I've already contacted my financial advisor to prepare liquidation options for the necessary capital. What I need from you is threefold. First, a discreet investigation into Pinewood Healthcare Holdings' financial position. Second, preparation for acquisition negotiation. And third, development of a legal structure that protects both my assets and privacy during this process." For the first time, Marion smiled. Ms. Parker, I typically advise clients to proceed cautiously with business acquisitions, particularly in regulated industries like healthcare. However, I sense you've given this considerable thought. My career was spent educating children. Ms. Silverman. In retirement, I've found a new purpose, ensuring dignity for those at the opposite end of life's journey. Pinewood Acres represents everything wrong with commoditized elder care. I have the resources to demonstrate a better model. By the end of our 2-hour consultation, we had established a clear action plan. Marion would engage a healthcare business, analyst to evaluate Pinewood's financial position, assemble a discovery team to document regulatory violations, and begin structuring an acquisition approach through a newly created LLC that would shield my identity during negotiations. Upon returning to Pinewood Acres, I found Robert Williams waiting in the courtyard as arranged. The space was technically an outdoor area, but offered little beyond concrete benches surrounding a neglected planter where wilted petunias struggled for survival. "I was concerned you might not return," Robert commented as I joined him. Many would seize the opportunity for escape. "I'm not interested in escape," I replied. "I'm interested in transformation." Over the next hour, Robert provided invaluable insights into Pinewood's operations. As a former administrator himself, he recognized patterns of systematic corner cutting designed to maximize profit while technically maintaining minimum regulatory compliance. He identified key staffing gaps, detailed maintenance issues that posed safety hazards, and shared concerning incidents he had witnessed during his 2-year residence. The most insidious aspect is how they isolate residents from effective advocacy, he explained. Family visits are subtly discouraged through inconvenient hours and uncomfortable visiting areas. Residents with cognitive impairments have no one to speak for them. Those of us still fully aware are dismissed as complainers if we raise concerns. Have residents ever organized collectively to address these issues? I asked. Robert's laugh held no humor. Organization requires energy, leadership, and hope, all in limited supply here. Most new arrivals spend their first months in depression, their middle period in resignation, and their final stage 2 diminished to effect change. That pattern stops now, I stated, sharing a carefully edited version of my intentions. While I didn't reveal the full scope of my financial resources or specific plans for acquisition, I explained my background in educational administration and my interest in improving conditions through documented accountability. I need allies, Robert. Residents willing to document their experiences systematically. Not complaints, objective observations with dates, times, specific incidents, evidence that would stand up to regulatory scrutiny. Robert studied me with the evaluative gaze of someone who had spent decades assessing both potential and character in others. You're not just talking about incremental improvements to the existing system. No, I'm not. There are 7 residents here who still have complete cognitive clarity and observational skills. Former professionals, a nurse, an accountant, a building inspector among them. People who understand systems and documentation. Could you introduce me, discreetly? Robert nodded slowly. We have a weekly bridge game in the activity room, purely social, according to official schedules. Could easily become something more purposeful. That evening, I attended my first bridge game at Pinewood Acres. While cards were indeed played, the true purpose emerged during strategic conversations between hands. I met Robert's carefully selected allies, each bringing unique, professional expertise and each harboring deep frustration with the conditions they endured. Martha Chen, a retired nurse, had been documenting medication errors in a small notebook for months, but had no effective channel for reporting her findings. George Abernathy, formerly with the County Building Inspector's Office, had identified numerous code violations throughout the facility. Helen Winters, who had worked as an accountant for a hospital system, recognized patterns in staffing allocations designed to create the appearance of adequate coverage, while actually operating below safe levels. By the end of the evening, we had formed what Robert Riley termed the Dignity Coalition, a core group committed to systematic documentation of facility deficiencies. Each member would focus on their area of expertise, collecting evidence according to standards that would withstand regulatory or legal scrutiny. As I prepared for bed that night, my roommate, Mrs. Henderson, watched me with newfound curiosity. Though physically frail, her mind remained sharp, and she had observed the subtle change in my demeanor. "You're different from other new residents," she noted quietly. "Everyone else arrives broken. You arrived determined." I sat on the edge of my bed, meeting her gaze directly. "The difference isn't me, Mrs. Henderson. It's that I still remember who I was before crossing this threshold. We all arrived here as complete people with valuable skills, experiences, and capabilities. This place is designed to make us forget that." "What are you planning?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I smiled, adjusting her blanket where it had slipped from her shoulder. "A reminder that age doesn't determine value. Rest now. Things will begin changing soon." As I lay in bed that night, listening to the sounds of an understaffed facility struggling through night shift, I felt something I hadn't expected to find in this dismal place: purpose crystallizing into action. My children had intended my placement here as an ending. They couldn't have realized they had actually set in motion an entirely new beginning, not just for me, but potentially for every current and future resident of Pinewood Acres. Tomorrow would bring a call from my financial advisor with acquisition options, further consultation with Marion Silverman regarding legal strategy, and the first formal documentation session with my newly formed coalition. The pathway from discard to dignity had begun, and it would transform far more than just a substandard nursing home. By the end of my first week at Pinewood Acres, our Dignity Coalition had expanded to 12 members. Each brought unique skills from their professional lives that now served our collective purpose. Margaret Foster, a retired paralegal, organized our documentation system with legal precision. Frank Donnelly, who had managed logistics for a regional grocery chain, created efficient communication channels that allowed us to share observations without raising administrative suspicion. The morning of my 8th day began with a secure video call with Peter Harrison, my financial advisor, and Marion Silverman, who had already made significant progress on the legal framework for acquisition. "Eleanor, I've completed the preliminary financial investigation of Pinewood Healthcare Holdings," Peter reported from my tablet screen. I had positioned myself in a secluded corner of the courtyard, ensuring privacy. "The situation is exactly as we suspected. They own 17 facilities across 3 states, all operating on the same bare minimum model." "What's their financial position?" I asked, taking notes in a small notebook that appeared to any casual observer, like a resident simply recording bird sightings or daily reflections. "Over-leveraged," Peter replied. "They expanded too rapidly 3 years ago, acquiring 7 facilities simultaneously. Current debt-to-income ratio is concerning, especially with rising interest rates affecting their variable rate loans. Their last quarterly report showed narrowing margins due to increased compliance costs." Marion nodded. "This aligns with my team's findings. They've received citations at 12 of their 17 facilities within the past 18 months. Nothing severe enough to threaten licensure, but the pattern suggests systematic underinvestment in staffing and infrastructure." "They're vulnerable," I concluded, "especially if facing potential regulatory scrutiny or negative publicity. Have you identified the decision-makers for potential acquisition discussions?" "The company is privately held," Marion explained. "Primary ownership lies with Harrison Wentworth, who serves as CEO. He inherited the business from his father, but appears more interested in expansion than operations. The regional manager overseeing Pinewood Acres is Victoria Hamilton, Harvard MBA, formerly with a management consulting firm. Based on her professional history, she prioritizes efficiency metrics over care quality." I absorbed this information, mentally calculating approach strategies. What's our timeline for preparing an acquisition offer? We've established Silver Horizons LLC as your acquisition vehicle, Marion said. The corporate structure shields your identity while maintaining your control over operations. We could present an initial offer as early as next week, assuming you wish to proceed directly rather than waiting for additional financial leverage. I want to move quickly, but strategically, I replied. The conditions here deteriorate daily. Last night, Mrs. Patel in room 14 waited 40 minutes for assistance after falling. The overnight staff consisted of 1 nurse and 1 aide for all 48 residents. Peter and Marion exchanged concerned glances, the human impact of the situation overriding their professional detachment momentarily. We've prepared 3 potential offer structures, Peter continued, returning to financial matters. Each provides different balances of cash, financing, and contingencies. I've analyzed tax implications and capital preservation options for each scenario. For the next 30 minutes, we discuss technical aspects of the potential acquisition, valuation, models, negotiation strategies, transition planning, and regulatory considerations. When the call ended, I had a clear path forward and renewed determination. I found Robert in the activities room, ostensibly engaged in a solitary game of chess. In reality, he was documenting a recurring safety violation, the emergency exit, whose alarm had been disabled by staff tired of its frequent malfunctions. Progress? He asked quietly as I sat across from him, positioning a chess piece to maintain our cover. Significant. I'll have more concrete updates soon. How are our documentation efforts proceeding? Robert's eyes conveyed satisfaction despite his neutral expression. Beyond expectations, Martha's medication error log now covers 27 incidents, all with witness corroboration. George has identified 15 building code violations, 5 presenting imminent safety hazards. Helen's staffing analysis demonstrates patterns that violate state-mandated care ratios during 60% of overnight shifts. Excellent work. Has anyone raised suspicions about our activities? The beauty of being elderly in a facility like this, Robert replied with subtle irony, is near complete invisibility. Staff attribute any unusual gatherings to social desperation or confusion. Our most strategic conversations occur during officially scheduled activities, hiding in plain sight. I moved a chess piece, maintaining our pretense. We need to accelerate documentation of nutrition and hydration issues. Several residents show signs of undernourishment that cannot be attributed solely to health conditions. Margaret has already begun. She's created a system for recording meal composition and portion sizes, comparing them against dietary requirements for various health conditions. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Brenda Wilkins, the facility director, accompanied by a woman I hadn't seen before. Both wore tailored business attire that contrasted sharply with residents' informal clothing and staff uniforms. Just checking on our residents enjoying activities, Brenda announced with rehearsed cheerfulness. Her companion observed the room with clinical detachment, occasionally making notes on a tablet. Robert and I exchanged a subtle glance. This unexpected, administrative presence warranted investigation. Later that afternoon, Helen secured valuable intelligence from a receptionist with whom she had cultivated a friendly relationship. The visiting woman was Victoria Hamilton, the regional manager Peter and Marion had identified. Her unscheduled visit suggested potential concerns about the facility's performance or finances. This development accelerated our timeline. If Pinewood Healthcare Holdings was already scrutinizing this location, changes might be implemented that could disrupt our documentation efforts or, worse, result in superficial improvements designed to mask systemic problems. That evening, our core group gathered under the guise of a birthday celebration for Frank. The activity room had been decorated with modest streamers, and a store-bought cake provided legitimate cover for our strategic discussion. We need to Understand exactly what prompted Victoria Hamilton's visit, I began once we had ensured privacy. Her presence could indicate various scenarios: financial concerns, compliance issues, potential sale preparation, each requiring different tactical responses from our group. My source in administration mentioned budget reviews happening this week, offered Helen. Apparently, census numbers are down across their facilities. They're operating at 82% capacity, while their financial model requires 90%. That's consistent with what I've observed in their staffing adjustments, added Martha. They've reduced nursing hours by approximately 15% over the past 3 months, while resident needs have remained constant. The mathematical impossibility of providing adequate care is becoming increasingly evident. I overheard Victoria asking about inspection schedules, George contributed. Specifically, how much advance notice they typically receive. Suggests concern about regulatory compliance. As we synthesized this intelligence, I shared a carefully edited version of my acquisition strategy, presenting it as a potential outcome, rather than a definite plan. The group's response was cautiously optimistic, tempered by justifiable skepticism about significant institutional change. In my experience, Frank noted, corporate ownership transitions rarely benefit residents. New owners typically implement cost-cutting measures to recoup their investment expenses. This transition would be different, I assured him. The acquisition would prioritize care standards over profit margins, with reinvestment in staffing, facility improvements, and quality of life enhancements. How can you be certain? Martha asked directly. Such promises require financial backing that most operators lack or abandon when facing market pressures. The question required a delicate balance between transparency and discretion. I have connections to socially responsible investors who recognize that ethical care can coexist with financial sustainability, I explained. Not maximum profit, but sufficient return while maintaining dignity standards. Robert, who understood more than I had explicitly shared, provided subtle support. Eleanor's background includes significant experience with resource allocation in educational systems. Her approach balances fiscal responsibility with human needs. The discussion continued, addressing practical concerns, potential risks, and what each coalition member could contribute to this evolving strategy. By evening's end, we had strengthened our alliance and established clear action priorities for the coming week. The following morning brought unexpected development. Sarah, my daughter, appeared in the doorway of my room, her expression a practiced blend of filial duty and discomfort. "Mom, I came as soon as I could get away," she began, setting down a small gift bag on my narrow bedside table. "How are you settling in? Is everything adequate?" I studied my daughter carefully. At 42, Sarah had constructed a life that appeared successful by conventional standards. Executive position, tastefully decorated suburban home, children enrolled in private schools, luxury vehicle recently upgraded. Yet beneath this careful curation lay persistent insecurity, a fear that any deviation from social expectations might reveal some fundamental inadequacy. "Hello, Sarah," I replied, neither expressing delight nor revealing my strategic activities. "This is certainly an environment that inspires reflection on life choices." She glanced around the sparse room, noticing without acknowledging the institutional bleakness. "The administrator said you've been participating in activities. That's good. Staying engaged is important." "Indeed. I've made several interesting connections. Many residents here had remarkable careers before circumstances brought them to Pinewood Acres." Sarah nodded uncomfortably, her gaze never quite meeting mine. "I brought you some toiletries and new slippers. David said the bathroom situation is shared. I thought having your own supplies might make things more comfortable." The small kindness, addressing symptoms rather than causes, crystallized my understanding of my children's limited moral imagination. they could conceive of improving my soap quality, but not questioning the systemic failures that placed me in undignified conditions. Thank you. Perhaps next visit you could bring something more valuable than toiletries, Sarah. Her expression registered confusion. Of course, Mom. What would you like? More clothes? Books? Information, I replied evenly. I'd like to understand the financial arrangements you and David made regarding my house and assets. Sarah's discomfort visibly intensified. Everything is being handled appropriately. The house sale proceeds are in a trust for your ongoing care. David has all the paperwork. A trust I apparently don't control. For care I didn't choose. In a facility selected without my input. I kept my tone factual rather than accusatory. Mom, these decisions were made for your protection. After your fall, my minor stumble, I corrected. We needed to ensure your safety. The house was too much responsibility. This place provides everything you need. I gestured toward the thin mattress, shared bathroom, and institutional surroundings. Everything I need? Sarah, do you genuinely believe this environment represents appropriate care for anyone's parent? Sarah's expression shifted from discomfort to defensive irritation. We did the best we could with the resources available, Mom. Not everyone can afford luxury retirement communities. Your pension and Social Security only cover so much. The statement confirmed my suspicions about their financial assumptions. I chose not to correct her misperceptions yet. That revelation would come at a more strategic moment. I see, I said simply. And when did you last speak with the trust administrator about expenditure authorizations for my care? David handles those details, she replied, checking her watch subtly. Look, Mom, I can't stay long today. Jamie has tennis lessons at 11, and I promised to help chaperone. Of course. Tennis lessons take priority. Sarah sighed, interpreting my comment as typical maternal guilt-inducing rather than the straightforward assessment it was. I'll try to visit again next weekend. Is there anything specific you need before then? Just clarity, Sarah. Something I'll apparently need to seek elsewhere. After she departed, I reviewed my interaction objectively. The visit had confirmed important elements of my children's narrative. They believed my financial resources were limited, considered my placement a necessary compromise based on available funds, and had established a trust structure that removed my financial autonomy. This information would prove invaluable in the coming phases of my plan. Not for revenge. Resentment would only distract from my primary objective of transforming Pinewood Acres into a model of dignified, affordable care. Rather, these insights would help me time certain revelations for maximum effectiveness in reshaping not just a facility, but perhaps my children's understanding of value, dignity, and responsibility. I contacted Marion immediately after Sarah's departure, requesting an expanded investigation into the trust arrangements established by my children and any legal dependencies between that structure and my planned acquisition. The pieces were aligning more clearly now, not just for institutional transformation, but for a more profound recalibration of relationships and responsibilities. That evening, as our coalition continued its methodical documentation of facility deficiencies, I felt growing certainty that our efforts would succeed. Not because of my financial resources alone, but because we had assembled something more powerful, a community of skilled individuals whose commitment to dignity transcended their own circumstances, working collectively toward systemic change, rather than mere personal comfort. 2 weeks into my residency at Pinewood Acres, Marion Silverman's investigation into the trust my children had established revealed concerning irregularities. We discussed the findings during a secure video call in my now regular spot in the courtyard, where the poor Wi-Fi connectivity discouraged other residents from lingering. Eleanor, I've reviewed the trust documentation my team obtained, Marion began, her professional demeanor not quite masking her discomfort with what she'd discovered. The Eleanor Parker Care Trust established by your children contains several problematic provisions. Specific concerns? I prompted, maintaining my composure despite anticipating troubling news. First, you were never formally designated as an interested party, meaning you have no legal right to information about the trust's activities. Second, your children appointed them. We discussed the findings during a secure video call in my now regular spot in the courtyard, where the poor Wi-Fi connectivity discouraged other residents from lingering. Eleanor, I've reviewed the trust documentation my team obtained, Marion began, her professional demeanor not quite masking her discomfort with what she'd discovered. The Eleanor Parker Care Trust established by your children contains several problematic provisions. Specific concerns? I prompted, maintaining my composure despite anticipating troubling news. First, you were never formally designated as an interested party, meaning you have no legal right to information about the trust's activities. Second, your children appointed themselves as co-trustees with unrestricted discretion over expenditures. Third, and most concerning, the trust permits reasonable compensation to the trustees for their administrative services. I processed this information methodically. Have they been paying themselves from these funds? Marion nodded gravely. Monthly withdrawals of $3,000 each began immediately after the trust's establishment. The justification listed is administrative, oversight and vendor management, though there's minimal evidence of active trust management beyond paying your Pinewood Acres invoices. And the house proceeds? The sale completed 3 weeks ago, $428,000 after closing costs, all deposited to the trust. However, there was an immediate withdrawal of $85,000 designated as emergency family support allocation. No further details provided. The revelation confirmed my worst assumptions about my children's actions, yet strangely, I felt more disappointed than angry. Their behavior reflected not just financial opportunism, but a profound failure of moral imagination, an inability to recognize the humanity and dignity of their own mother beyond her utility to their financial interests. What are our options? I asked, focusing on solutions rather than dwelling on the betrayal. Several, Marion replied. We could contest the trust on grounds of undue influence or breach of fiduciary duty. However, litigation would be public, potentially prolonged, and might complicate your acquisition strategy for Pinewood. Alternatively, given your actual financial resources, we could proceed with the acquisition while simultaneously preparing more discreet remedies regarding the trust. The second approach seems preferable, I decided. Let's maintain focus on the acquisition while documenting the trust irregularities for future addressing. What's our timeline for presenting an offer to Pinewood Healthcare Holdings? We're prepared to move forward immediately. Our investigation confirms they're in a vulnerable financial position. 3 of their facilities are operating at significant losses, and their debt service is consuming approximately 23% of monthly revenue. Their most recent loan covenant review shows they're dangerously close to triggering default provisions. Then it's time to apply pressure, I concluded. Let's proceed with the initial acquisition approach through Silver Horizons LLC. Simultaneously, I'll need you to prepare documentation for regulatory authorities regarding the care deficiencies our resident coalition has documented. Marion looked concerned. Leveraging regulatory action while pursuing acquisition could be perceived as aggressive or potentially manipulative. It's neither, I clarified. These are legitimate violations affecting vulnerable residents that would be reported regardless of acquisition interests. The timing may create leverage, but the substantive concerns exist independently and deserve address. After finalizing our strategy, I rejoined my coalition partners for our afternoon documentation session. We had established a routine of meeting during scheduled card games, using the activity as cover for our increasingly sophisticated monitoring operation. Victoria Hamilton returned this morning, reported Margaret, our former paralegal. She spent 2 hours reviewing financial records with the administrative staff. One of the kitchen workers overheard her mentioning difficult decisions ahead. The medication situation. We have sufficient documentation for regulatory action, I informed the group. However, I've learned that meaningful change rarely comes from outside enforcement alone. Facilities often make minimum corrections to satisfy inspectors without addressing underlying systemic issues. What alternative approach do you suggest? Asked Robert, who had become my most trusted ally. Transformation from within, I replied. I've been developing a strategy that could fundamentally restructure Pinewood's ownership and operating model. It would require patience during transition, but could establish a new standard for affordable elder care. I outlined a version of my acquisition plan, presenting it as a developing possibility rather than an imminent reality. The group responded with a mixture of cautious hope and practical questions about implementation challenges. The critical element, I emphasized, is maintaining our documentation efforts through any transition. Regardless of ownership, accountability, structures must be established that prioritize resident dignity over financial metrics. After our meeting, Robert accompanied me on a walk through the facility grounds, a concrete path circling the building that staff optimistically called the garden trail despite its lack of actual gardens. You've been careful about revealing your full strategy, he observed once we were beyond others' hearing range. I respect the discretion, but sense there's more to your approach than you've shared with the group. His perceptiveness didn't surprise me. As a former school principal, Robert had developed keen awareness of unspoken dynamics. You're right, I acknowledged. Some aspects remain confidential until certain legal arrangements are secured. What I can tell you is that my resources and commitment extend beyond what might be apparent. I suspected as much. Your composure since arrival suggested someone with contingency plans rather than someone trapped by circumstance. Circumstances rarely trap those who refuse the assigned narrative, I replied. Even in situations with genuine constraints, how we interpret and respond to limitations remains our choice. Robert nodded thoughtfully. A philosophy that served you well throughout your life, I imagine. Not consistently, I admitted. I made the common mistake of believing my children shared my values simply because I had raised them. I failed to recognize how external influences and personal insecurities could reshape their priorities. Yet you're not pursuing punishment as your primary objective. Punishment changes little. Transformation offers more profound possibilities, not just for systems, but for individuals. My children made choices based on their understanding of value and responsibility. Perhaps experiencing an alternative model might expand that understanding. The following morning brought unexpected developments. First, a call from Marion confirmed our acquisition offer had been delivered to Harrison Wentworth, CEO of Pinewood Healthcare Holdings. His initial response indicated surprise, but not immediate rejection, a promising sign given the company's financial vulnerability. More surprising was the arrival of my son David, unannounced and visibly uncomfortable as he awkwardly navigated the facility corridors searching for my room. "Mom," he began when he finally located me in the common area where I was conducting a seemingly casual conversation with Frank that actually involved documenting mealtime deficiencies. "Can we talk privately?" I excused myself from Frank with a subtle nod acknowledging our conversation would continue later. Leading David to my shared room, I found Mrs. Henderson absent, likely at her physical therapy session. "This is unexpected," I observed as David remained standing, too unsettled to sit on either available chair. "No administrative conference calls today?" He winced slightly at the reference to his previous hasty departure. "Sarah mentioned you had questions about the trust arrangements. I brought some documents to clarify things." He removed several folders from his briefcase, arranging them on the narrow bedside table. "I've spoken with the administrator about upgrading you to a private room," he continued while organizing papers. Unfortunately, there's a waiting list, but I've emphasized our willingness to pay a reasonable premium for expedited consideration. How generous, I remarked, leaving intentional ambiguity about whether I meant his visit, the documents, or the room upgrade offer. David finally looked directly at me, his expression a complex mixture of defensive justification and genuine concern. Mom, I know this place isn't ideal, but your resources are limited, and we need it to make practical decisions. My resources? Or the resources you believe I have? The question caused a momentary flicker of confusion across his face. Your pension, Social Security, and the house proceeds are carefully budgeted to provide for your long-term care. That's what these projections show. He indicated one of the folders. We've established a sustainable financial model that should ensure your needs are covered for at least 8 years, assuming moderate inflation in care costs. And the monthly payments to you and Sarah for administrative services? Are those factored into this sustainable model? David's posture stiffened noticeably. Those are reasonable compensation for the significant time investment required to manage your affairs. We've both taken time from our careers and family responsibilities to arrange appropriate care for you. I see. And the $85,000 emergency family allocation? Now genuine alarm registered on his face. How did you... He stopped himself, recalibrating his response. Those funds covered essential expenses related to your transition, including storage costs for remaining household items, legal fees for establishing the trust, and necessary family support during this adjustment period. The careful language couldn't disguise the essential truth. They had diverted nearly 20% of my house proceeds to their personal use almost immediately after establishing the trust supposedly dedicated to my care. Rather than expressing anger, I maintained calm inquiry. David, do you believe the conditions here represent dignified care for someone who dedicated their life to education and raised 2 children to successful adulthood? He glanced around the institutional room, uncomfortably acknowledging its limitations. It meets basic standards, Mom. Not everyone can afford luxury retirement options. We're doing the best we can with the available resources. And if more resources were available, would your definition of best possible care expand accordingly? Of course, but that's not our reality. His tone held the practiced patience of someone explaining obvious constraints to someone who failed to grasp financial realities. Reality is often more complex than our initial assessment suggests, I replied. I've been developing a different perspective on elder care since arriving here, one that might interest you as both my son and as someone with eventual aging concerns of your own. David checked his watch. An expensive model I noticed was newer than the one he'd worn during my move-in. I have a client meeting in 90 minutes. Could we discuss your philosophical realizations next visit? I wanted to ensure you had these financial documents to address your concerns. By all means, attend your meeting. We'll have opportunities for more substantive conversations soon enough. After he departed, I reviewed the documents he'd provided. They confirmed Marion's findings while revealing additional concerning elements: projected care budgets that barely covered minimal services, no allowances for quality-of-life enhancements, and contingency provisions that prioritized trust preservation over care quality if funds began depleting faster than projected. The documentation would prove valuable in addressing the trust issues, but more immediately, it reinforced my commitment to transforming Pinewood Acres, not just for myself, but for every resident subjected to its dignity-stripping environment. That afternoon brought a pivotal development. Marion called to inform me that Harrison Wentworth had agreed to an initial meeting regarding our acquisition offer, scheduled for the following week. More significantly, our documentation of care deficiencies had been strategically shared with regulatory authorities, triggering an unannounced inspection scheduled within days. The timing creates maximum leverage, Marion explained. They'll enter negotiations knowing regulatory penalties are imminent unless significant improvements occur immediately. improvements that would require capital they don't have readily available. Perfect, I replied. Meanwhile, we'll continue, documenting current conditions to ensure accurate baseline comparison during any transition. Has the offer structure been finalized? Yes. Silver Horizons LLC will present a cash offer of $4, $2 million for Pinewood Acres specifically, not the entire Pinewood Healthcare Holdings portfolio. The offer includes contingencies regarding staff retention, regulatory compliance remediation, and a transition period during which you would have oversight authority without public disclosure of your resident status. The strategy was unfolding, precisely as planned. The regulatory inspection would validate our documented concerns, creating pressure that made our acquisition offer more attractive. Once ownership transferred, we could implement immediate quality improvements while developing longer-term transformation of the operating model. That evening, as I sat with Robert and our core coalition members in the courtyard, I felt the first genuine optimism since arriving at Pinewood Acres. Not because my personal situation would improve. I could have simply left at any point given my actual financial resources, but because we were positioned to create systemic change that would benefit dozens of current residents and hundreds of future ones. Something's different, Martha observed, studying my expression. You've received news. Let's just say certain elements are aligning, I replied. Within 2 weeks, we may begin seeing tangible changes in operating conditions. The documentation you've all contributed has proven invaluable to this process. Regulatory inspection? Asked George, whose experience with building code enforcement made him particularly attuned to compliance mechanisms. Among other measures, I confirmed. But regulatory action alone rarely creates sustainable change. What follows will be more comprehensive. Robert met my gaze with quiet understanding. You've secured influence beyond what any of us anticipated, haven't you? I've simply recognized that assumed limitations often prove less restrictive than they first appear, I replied, particularly when one refuses to accept artificial constraints on possibility. As twilight settled over Pinewood Acres, residents were herded toward their rooms for the unnecessarily early bedtime imposed by inadequate overnight staffing. Yet within our coalition, a different energy prevailed, the revitalization that comes from purposeful action rather than passive acceptance. We had transformed from discarded individuals into a coordinated force for systemic change, demonstrating that dignity never expires regardless of age or circumstance. More importantly, we had created a model for reclaiming agency within seemingly rigid institutional constraints, a model that could extend far beyond this single facility. The next phase would bring ownership transition, operational transformation, and a fundamental reconception of what constituted appropriate elder care. It would also bring something more personal, a powerful demonstration to my children that value isn't determined by conventional metrics of productivity or economic utility, but by the courage to insist on dignity for oneself and others. As I prepared for sleep that night, I reflected on how my children's attempt to remove me from their lives had inadvertently connected me to a community and purpose more meaningful than anything I had experienced since retirement. Their dismissal had become the catalyst for creation rather than the sentence of irrelevance they had intended. The regulatory inspection arrived 3 days later, unannounced at 6:15 a.m., deliberately timed to observe shift change and morning care routines when staffing inadequacies would be most evident. The inspection team consisted of 3 individuals whose confident movements and methodical approach suggested extensive experience identifying compliance violations. I observed from the dining area, maintaining the appearance of a resident simply having early morning tea while discreetly noting the inspector's focus areas. Brenda Wilkins, the facility director, arrived within 20 minutes, her typically composed demeanor visibly rattled by this unexpected scrutiny. She trailed the inspection team with increasing agitation as they examined medication storage protocols, reviewed staffing schedules, and interviewed night shift employees before they could depart. Our coalition's strategic preparation proved invaluable. When inspectors entered the East Wing where 6 of our members resided, they encountered residents who articulated concerns with remarkable specificity. Not general complaints, but detailed observations referencing precise regulations and documentation standards. Martha discreetly directed inspectors to examine the medication error log, where chronically short-staffed overnight shifts had resulted in missed or delayed dosing. George casually mentioned persistent plumbing issues in the North Wing bathrooms, guiding investigators toward the concealed mold growth. By mid-morning, the inspection had expanded beyond standard protocol, suggesting they had identified serious concerns warranting deeper investigation. Victoria Hamilton arrived with unprecedented speed, her luxury sedan pulling into the reserved administrative parking space before noon. Her tailored business attire and brisk pace toward the administrative offices conveyed the gravity with which Pinewood Healthcare Holdings viewed this regulatory intervention. Robert entered the common area where I sat reviewing notes, his expression containing subtle satisfaction. "They're inspecting the kitchen now," he reported quietly. The lead investigator requested documentation of nutrition plans for residents with specific dietary requirements. When Brenda couldn't produce them immediately, he extended the inspection to include meal preparation protocols. "Excellent," I responded. "Have they interviewed residents individually?" "They're scheduled to begin after lunch. They've requested private conversation space and indicated interviews may continue through tomorrow. Margaret is coordinating to ensure our most articulate members are prioritized in the schedule." The systematic approach of both inspectors and our coalition represented months of preparation compressed into days of action. While regulatory scrutiny alone wouldn't transform Pinewood Acres, it created essential pressure that reinforced our acquisition strategy. Harrison Wentworth would enter negotiations knowing his company faced potentially significant penalties unless immediate costly improvements were implemented, improvements that would strain their already precarious finances. Around 3 o'clock, as I completed my scheduled interview with the inspection team, my phone signaled an incoming call from Marion Silverman. "Eleanor, I've received communication from Pinewood Healthcare Holdings legal team," she reported, once I had secured privacy in the courtyard. "They're requesting an expedited meeting regarding our acquisition offer, tomorrow rather than next week as originally scheduled. Victoria Hamilton will attend alongside Harrison Wentworth. Their regulatory inspection anxiety is creating leverage," I observed. "Who will represent Silver Horizons LLC at the meeting?" "I'll attend as legal counsel, and Peter Harrison as financial representative. We've prepared comprehensive documentation of Pinewood Acres compliance deficiencies alongside our acquisition proposal. The offer includes remediation funding explicitly allocated to addressing regulatory violations before penalties are assessed." "Perfect. Maintain the anonymous investor narrative regarding ownership. I'm not ready to reveal my connection until we've secured preliminary agreement." After finishing with Marion, I returned inside to find unusual commotion near the entrance. Through the gathering of curious residents and concerned staff, I glimpsed my son David engaged in animated conversation with Brenda Wilkins. His presence, during a regulatory inspection, couldn't be coincidental. I approached with measured calm, arriving just as David's voice rose in evident frustration. "I need to speak with my mother immediately. These allegations are completely baseless." "Mr. Parker," Brenda replied with strained professionalism, "as I've explained, the inspection is a routine regulatory procedure. Your mother hasn't been singled out for any reason." "Then why did I receive a call about unauthorized interviews and complaints filed under her name?" David demanded. I intervened before Brenda could respond. "Hello, David. This is unexpected." His attention snapped toward me, relief briefly crossing his features before returning to concern. "Mom, we need to talk privately. There's been some confusion regarding your care satisfaction." No confusion whatsoever, I replied evenly. I participated in a standard regulatory interview, as did many residents. Is there some reason that concerns you? David glanced uncomfortably at Brenda and the small audience of curious residents. Perhaps we could discuss this in your room. Once in the relative privacy of my shared accommodations, Mrs. Henderson was at physical therapy again. David's controlled demeanor fractured. What exactly are you doing, Mom? I received a call from Victoria Hamilton intimating that you've been coordinating resident complaints against the facility. She suggested your actions could jeopardize your placement here. Interesting that she would contact you directly rather than addressing concerns with me, I observed. I wonder what regulation covers threatening residents who participate honestly. In state-mandated inspections? David ran a hand through his hair in frustration. This isn't about regulations. It's about maintaining stable care arrangements for you. Do you understand how difficult it would be to find alternative placement on short notice if they decide to discharge you? The irony of his concern, genuine yet fundamentally self-interested, was striking. David wasn't worried about my welfare, so much as the disruption that my potential discharge would create for him. I understand precisely what's at stake, I replied. Perhaps better than you realize. Then why deliberately antagonize the administration? If you had concerns about your care, you should have brought them to Sarah or me. We could have addressed them through proper channels. Proper channels, I repeated. Like the trust you established supposedly for my benefit but structured to exclude me from decision-making? Or perhaps like the $85,000 emergency family allocation you withdrew immediately after my house sale? David's expression shifted from frustration to defensive alarm. How did you access those financial details? Those trust documents are confidential administrative information. Apparently not as confidential as you believed, nor as legally sound as you might have hoped. What exactly are you implying? His voice lowered, tension evident in his rigid posture. I'm not implying anything, David. I'm directly stating that I'm fully aware of how you and Sarah have managed my affairs, from the unnecessary placement in substandard care to the financial arrangements that prioritized your convenience and benefit over my dignity and well-being. For several moments, David seemed genuinely speechless, his carefully constructed narrative visibly crumbling before unanticipated opposition. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted from authoritative to cautiously placating. Mom, I think you've misunderstood our intentions. Everything we've done has been to ensure your long-term security with the limited resources available. Pinewood Acres may not be luxury accommodations, but it's what we can sustainably afford given your financial situation. My financial situation, I echoed. Tell me, David, did you ever actually review my complete financial records before making these decisions on my behalf? Or did you simply assume my resources matched your preconceptions? Confusion flickered across his features. We had complete documentation of your pension, Social Security benefits, and home equity. What else would there be? The moment had arrived sooner than anticipated, but perhaps more effectively than my planned revelation. I retrieved my tablet from the nightstand drawer and opened my investment portfolio summary. This might clarify some misconceptions, I said, handing him the device. David's expression transformed through a remarkable sequence: initial confusion, dawning comprehension, and finally stunned disbelief as he stared at the 8-figure sum displayed on the screen. This can't be correct, he stammered. How would you... Where did this come from? 40 years of disciplined investing, beginning with inheritance from my grandmother that I never mentioned to your father, while you and Sarah assumed I lived solely on my teacher's salary and pension. I was building a substantial investment portfolio that has performed exceptionally well through careful management. David continued staring at the numbers, struggling to reconcile this revelation with his existing understanding. Why didn't you tell us? Why would you allow placement in a facility like this when you could afford premium care anywhere? And Excellent question, I acknowledged. One that might lead to valuable reflection on assumptions, communication, and respect across generations. But at this moment, we have more immediate concerns. Specifically, the regulatory inspection occurring now will likely result in significant citations against Pinewood Acres, potentially affecting all residents' care conditions. If you had these resources all along, why stay here even a single night? Why not simply move to appropriate accommodations? Because dignified care shouldn't be available only to those with substantial personal wealth, I explained. Because every resident here deserves better than what Pinewood Healthcare Holdings provides. Because systems don't change unless someone with capacity and commitment forces that change. David's analytical mind began connecting implications with remarkable speed. You're not just participating in this inspection, you're driving it somehow. This is coordinated. Coordinated, documented, and strategically implemented, I confirmed. But the inspection is merely one component of a more comprehensive intervention. Before I could elaborate, my phone signaled an incoming call from Marion. "Excuse me, I need to take this," I told David, stepping toward the window for minimal privacy in the small room. "Eleanor," Marion began without preamble, "Harrison Wentworth has requested to move our meeting to today. He and Victoria Hamilton can be at our offices by 5 p.m., I believe the regulatory inspection has created significant pressure." "Agreed. Proceed with the accelerated timeline. I'll ensure our documentation is updated with today's inspection findings." As I ended the call, I turned to find David watching me with newfound awareness, recognizing for perhaps the first time that his mother possessed capabilities and agency he had failed to acknowledge. "Mom, exactly what are you involved in here?" "Transformation, David. Of this facility, its operating model, and perhaps of certain assumptions about value and dignity in later life stages." His expression reflected the intellectual recalibration occurring as he processed these revelations. "You're pursuing some kind of legal action against Pinewood?" "Not exactly legal action, more direct intervention. By this time tomorrow, Pinewood Acres will likely have new ownership with fundamentally different operating priorities." "New ownership? You mean you've connected with investors interested in acquiring this place?" His professional interest was clearly engaged now. "In a manner of speaking," I confirmed. "Silver Horizons LLC has presented an acquisition offer that Pinewood Healthcare Holdings will almost certainly accept, given their financial vulnerabilities and regulatory challenges." David's background in corporate finance enabled quick assessment of implications. "Silver Horizons. That's not an established healthcare operator. Is this a private equity play?" "It's a purpose-driven acquisition focused on establishing a new model for affordable quality care. The investor behind Silver Horizons has both financial resources and personal motivation to transform elder care standards." Something in my tone or expression must have triggered recognition. David's eyes widened slightly. "This investor, it's you, isn't it? You're acquiring Pinewood Acres." I neither confirmed nor denied, simply offering a smile that acknowledged his accurate deduction. "Market forces alone won't correct the systemic failures in affordable elder care, David. Sometimes direct intervention becomes necessary when existing models prioritize profit over dignity." He sank slowly onto the edge of my bed, the full magnitude of his misunderstanding becoming increasingly apparent. "You allowed yourself to be placed here, in these conditions, as part of some larger strategy?" I recognized an opportunity to address a significant social failure while simultaneously correcting certain misconceptions held by my children, I explained. "The experience has proven valuable on multiple levels, though I wouldn't recommend the cuisine." The weak attempt at humor fell flat against David's evident emotional turmoil, a complex mixture of shock, embarrassment, and dawning horror at the implications of his actions given my actual financial capacity. "Mom, we never," he began, struggling to formulate an adequate response. We'll have ample opportunity to discuss family dynamics later, I assured him. At present, I have a facility acquisition to complete and an inspection team to update with recent documentation. Perhaps you could inform Sarah about these developments. Her perspective might be valuable as we reconsider family decision-making approaches. David nodded mechanically, still processing this paradigm shift. As he rose to leave, he paused at the door. For what it's worth, I never intended. That is, we thought we were making responsible decisions given what we understood about your situation. I know, I acknowledged. That's what makes this a valuable learning opportunity rather than simply a painful revelation. Our understanding often limits our imagination regarding possibilities, something I hope to address not just with Pinewood Acres, but perhaps with family dynamics as well. After David departed, moving with the slightly dazed manner of someone whose fundamental assumptions had been dramatically disrupted, I returned to the courtyard to update Robert and our coalition leadership on accelerating developments. The acquisition meeting has been moved to today, I informed them. Pinewood Healthcare Holdings leadership is clearly responding to regulatory pressure. Meanwhile, my personal circumstances have experienced unexpected exposure. Your son seemed quite agitated when he left, Robert observed. Family complications? Family recalibrations, I corrected. Sometimes necessary disruption precedes improved understanding, but our focus remains institutional transformation, regardless of personal developments. As evening approached, our coalition continued coordinating with inspection teams, ensuring investigators accessed comprehensive documentation of systematic deficiencies. The regulatory machinery was now fully engaged, creating precisely the pressure necessary to facilitate ownership transition with minimum resistance. Tomorrow would bring formal acquisition negotiations, followed by implementation of immediate quality improvements for all residents. While my personal situation had always included escape options unavailable to most Pinewood residents, our collective effort had created pathway to dignity that would benefit everyone, including those without financial resources or family advocacy. The confrontation with David, while earlier than planned, had initiated necessary family recalibration. Not punishment or revenge, but honest reassessment of assumptions that had led to misguided decisions. Whether this would ultimately strengthen family relationships remained uncertain, but it had undeniably established a foundation of reality rather than convenient fiction. As night settled over Pinewood Acres, likely one of the last undercurrent, ownership, I felt not triumph but purposeful anticipation. The work of transformation had only begun, with implementation challenges still ahead. Yet, in confronting both institutional and family limitations simultaneously, I had demonstrated an essential truth. Dignity need never be surrendered, regardless of age, circumstance, or others' expectations. The next morning arrived with a sense of quiet anticipation at Pinewood Acres. The regulatory inspection team had departed late the previous evening after documenting dozens of compliance violations, promising a formal report within 5 business days. Their findings would become a powerful catalyst for immediate improvements under new ownership. At 7:30, I received a secure message from Marion confirming that Harrison Wentworth had signed a preliminary letter of intent regarding Silver Horizons LLC's acquisition offer. The final negotiation would take place at Marion's offices that afternoon, with completion contingent upon satisfactory resolution of certain operational details. I dressed with particular care, selecting one of the few professional outfits I had insisted on bringing to Pinewood despite David's protestations about limited storage space. The tailored navy suit and modest pearl accessories projected exactly the image I intended for today's revelation, not a vulnerable elderly resident, but a capable businesswoman executing a strategic acquisition. When Helen Winters, our coalition's financial specialist, spotted me in the hallway, she immediately recognized something significant had shifted. "Big day?" she inquired discreetly as we walked toward the dining hall. "Transformative," I confirmed. By this evening, Pinewood Acres will likely have new ownership with fundamentally different priorities. Helen processed this with remarkable equanimity. Your mysterious investor friends came through then? Or perhaps not so mysterious after all. Her perceptiveness didn't surprise me. As a former hospital system accountant, she had developed keen insight into both financial structures and human dynamics. Let's just say the investment represents deeply personal commitment to demonstrating that quality care and financial sustainability aren't mutually exclusive concepts, I replied. I'll share more specific details once arrangements are finalized. After breakfast, I met briefly with our core coalition members to outline immediate priorities once ownership transferred. We had developed a comprehensive transition plan addressing critical deficiencies while establishing new operational standards for the long term. Everyone understood their roles in maintaining accountability throughout the process, ensuring promised improvements actually materialized rather than becoming mere aspirational statements. At 11 o'clock, I received another message from Marion. Car service arranged for 12:30 p.m. pickup, HW and VH already proceeding with limited due diligence. Acquisition documentation prepared for signature today if terms finalized. The accelerated timeline confirmed what I had suspected. Pinewood Healthcare Holdings was eager to divest this increasingly problematic facility before regulatory penalties compounded their financial vulnerabilities. Their eagerness would strengthen our negotiating position regarding transition terms and responsibility for remediation costs. As I prepared for departure, Brenda Wilkins appeared at my door, her expression reflecting the strain of recent events. Ms. Parker, I understand you're planning to leave the facility today? Her tone suggested this represented yet another administrative complication in an already challenging week. Only temporarily, I assured her. I have business matters requiring personal attention. We generally require 24 hours notice for resident departures, she responded with reflexive adherence to protocol. And a family member should accompany you for liability reasons. I believe you'll find my admissions agreement contains no such stipulations, I replied calmly. I've arranged private transportation and will return this evening. Should any questions arise regarding my status, I suggest consulting Victoria Hamilton directly. Mentioning the regional manager created immediate effect. Brenda's expression shifted to confusion tinged with concern. You've spoken with Ms. Hamilton? Not directly, but I believe our paths may cross later today. Before Brenda could formulate a response, Martha Chen approached with purposeful stride. Eleanor, we need your input on the hydration monitoring system we're implementing. Several residents showed concerning signs during yesterday's assessment. This perfectly timed interruption, part of our coalition's coordinated communication strategy, provided graceful exit from conversation with Brenda. As we moved toward the common area, Martha whispered, Cars already outside. Black sedan by the east entrance where cameras have that convenient blind spot we documented. The systematic attention to detail that had characterized our documentation efforts now facilitated my discreet departure. Within minutes, I was seated in a luxury sedan provided by Marion's firm, heading toward downtown where negotiations would determine Pinewood Acres' future. Marion met me in the executive reception area of Silverman Legal Associates, her professional demeanor tinged with evident satisfaction. Harrison Wentworth and Victoria Hamilton arrived 20 minutes ago, she reported as we walked toward the conference room. They're reviewing our proposed terms with their legal counsel. Peter is monitoring their discussions while presenting final financial data. Their demeanor? I inquired. Resigned but pragmatic. The regulatory inspection findings were apparently more severe than they anticipated. They're focusing primarily on transition terms rather than questioning the fundamental acquisition. And they still don't know I'm the principal investor. Correct. They believe they're meeting Silver Horizon's legal representation first, with the primary investor joining later. Your entrance should prove quite illuminating. We paused outside the conference room's frosted glass doors. I took a moment to center myself, understanding that the next hour would determine not just Pinewood's future, but potentially influence broader approaches to affordable elder care. The strategy had never been about personal vindication, but rather systemic transformation, demonstrating that dignity need not be sacrificed to financial constraints. Ready? Marian asked, her hand on the door handle. Absolutely. The conference room fell silent as we entered. Harrison Wentworth, a man in his early 50s with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to controlling negotiations, sat at the head of the table. Beside him, Victoria Hamilton maintained the polished professional appearance I had observed during her facility visits, though tension evidenced itself in her slightly too rigid posture. Their legal counsel, a serious-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses, sat reviewing documents with focused attention that shifted immediately to assessment as I entered. Peter Harrison rose to greet us, maintaining the professional fiction we had established. Ms. Silverman, excellent. And this must be our principal investor? Yes, Marian confirmed. Gentlemen, Ms. Hamilton, allow me to introduce Eleanor Parker, majority stakeholder in Silver Horizons LLC, and the driving force behind this acquisition initiative. The momentary confusion on Victoria Hamilton's face transformed rapidly to shocked recognition. Ms. Parker, from Pinewood Acres? I don't understand. Harrison Wentworth's reaction showed less personal recognition but equal confusion. There must be some mistake. Ms. Parker is a resident at the facility under discussion. Current resident, I confirmed calmly, taking a seat directly across from Wentworth. And soon-to-be owner, assuming our negotiations conclude successfully today. The corporate attorney recovered first, professional training overriding personal. Surprise. This is highly irregular. Ms. Parker's status as a current resident creates potential conflicts regarding this transaction. On the contrary, Marian countered smoothly, Ms. Parker's first-hand experience provides invaluable insight into operational realities at Pinewood Acres. Her decision to acquire the facility stems directly from observing significant deficiencies in care standards, staffing protocols, and physical infrastructure, deficiencies now extensively documented by regulatory authorities. Victoria Hamilton found her voice, though it carried a defensive edge. If Ms. Parker had concerns about facility operations, appropriate channels exist for addressing them. This approach seems unnecessarily adversarial. I've found that appropriate channels often prioritize institutional convenience over resident dignity, I replied evenly. But we're not here to debate past management approaches. We're here to negotiate transfer of ownership and establish parameters for addressing the substantial compliance violations identified during yesterday's inspection. Harrison Wentworth studied me with recalibrated assessment, professional pragmatism asserting itself over initial surprise. You orchestrated the regulatory inspection as leverage for this acquisition. The inspection was inevitable given the documented deficiencies, I corrected. My coalition simply ensured investigators received comprehensive information rather than the sanitized version typically presented during announced visits. Coalition? Victoria questioned. Pinewood residents with professional backgrounds in healthcare, building inspection, financial analysis, and legal documentation. Individuals whose expertise you overlooked while viewing them solely as care recipients rather than valuable human resources. This revelation visibly unsettled both Pinewood executives. The realization that supposedly passive, compliant residents had organized sophisticated monitoring of operational deficiencies directly contradicted their fundamental assumptions about elder capability and agency. Wentworth recovered quickly, redirecting to practical considerations. Regardless of how we arrived at this point, we have proposed terms to review. Silver Horizons' offer contains several conditions requiring clarification. For the next 90 minutes, we engaged in detailed negotiation of acquisition parameters, purchase price, assumption of existing liabilities, transition timeline, staff retention requirements, and remediation responsibilities for documented violations. Throughout the discussion, I maintained calm authority, demonstrating comprehensive understanding of both healthcare regulations and financial implications that clearly surprised the Pinewood executives. Your proposed remediation timeline is unrealistic, Victoria argued, regarding our requirement for immediate correction of critical safety violations. These improvements require significant capital investment and contractor coordination that simply can't be accomplished within 30 days. I've already secured commitments from 3 licensed contractors specializing in healthcare facility. Improvements, I countered. They've reviewed preliminary assessments and confirmed capacity to address critical violations within 3 weeks of ownership transfer. What's lacking isn't feasibility, but prioritization of resident safety over financial convenience. As negotiations progressed, the power dynamic shifted perceptibly. Wentworth and Hamilton gradually abandoned their initially defensive posture, recognizing that Silver Horizons, and specifically I, had thoroughly prepared for this acquisition, with both financial resources and operational expertise they hadn't anticipated. There's one additional element I'd like to address, I stated as we approached conclusion. The acquisition agreement should explicitly acknowledge that all current residents may remain at Pinewood Acres regardless of payment source, with no displacement during renovation or operational transition. That's financially untenable, Wentworth objected. Several residents are Medicaid only, generating negative margins under current reimbursement rates. Those negative margins result from inefficient operating models, not inherent impossibility of sustainable care, I replied. Silver Horizons' business plan demonstrates feasibility of maintaining mixed payment residents while generating sufficient returns for operational sustainability. This non-displacement provision is non-negotiable. The exchange exemplified our fundamentally different approaches, Wentworth viewing elder care primarily through financial metrics, while I insisted on balanced consideration of human dignity alongside fiscal responsibility. Neither perspective was entirely wrong, but the historic imbalance favoring financial concerns over resident well-being had created the substandard conditions we aimed to correct. By late afternoon, we had reached agreement on all substantive terms. The final acquisition documents were prepared for signature, with closing scheduled in 3 business days following expedited due diligence. Ms. Parker, Wentworth said as we concluded, I must acknowledge your thorough preparation for this acquisition. Whatever our differences regarding operational priorities, your strategic approach has been impressive. His professional assessment represented genuine respect, if not necessarily endorsement of my methods. Strategic approaches reflect underlying values, I responded. Mine prioritize dignity, autonomy, and quality of life for individuals regardless of age or economic status. I hope Pinewood Healthcare Holdings will consider similar priorities for your remaining facilities. As the Pinewood executives departed with their counsel, Marion turned to me with quiet satisfaction. Congratulations, Eleanor. Ownership transfer should complete by Friday, allowing implementation of your transition plan immediately thereafter. The acquisition is merely foundation laying, I noted. The real work begins with transformation of operating culture and care standards. Financial transactions are simpler than human systems change. Speaking of human systems, Peter interjected tactfully, have you considered how to address the trust situation with your children once this becomes public knowledge? The question acknowledged the parallel personal dimension of recent events, how David and Sarah would respond to complete understanding of their mother's financial capacity and strategic capabilities. I've scheduled a family meeting for Sunday, I confirmed. By then, initial improvements at Pinewood will be visible, demonstrating that my objectives extend beyond personal comfort to systemic transformation. This context may facilitate more productive conversation about assumptions, autonomy, and intergenerational relationships. Upon returning to Pinewood Acres that evening, I found our coalition awaiting updates in the courtyard. Their expressions reflected mixture of anticipation and measured hope, people who had experienced too many institutional disappointments to embrace unreserved optimism. "It's done," I informed them simply. "Ownership transfers Friday. Implementation of our priority improvements begins Saturday morning." The collective exhalation of relief was almost palpable. For most residents, this represented the first time their documented concerns had translated to concrete action rather than administrative dismissal or minimal compliance adjustments. "What happens to current management?" asked George, our building inspector who had experienced particularly dismissive treatment from Brenda Wilkins when reporting safety hazards. "Facility leadership will be evaluated based on demonstrated commitment to new operating standards," I explained. "Those willing to embrace dignity-centered care models may remain with appropriate retraining. Those fundamentally misaligned with resident-centered priorities will be transitioned out with appropriate severance." "And what about you?" Martha inquired. "Will you continue residing here during transition?" "Temporarily. My effectiveness during implementation requires maintaining first-hand awareness of daily operations rather than managing remotely. Additionally, remaining here reinforces our fundamental principle that Pinewood can and should provide dignified care that I'm willing to experience personally, not just impose on others with fewer options." As our discussion continued, Robert pulled me aside for a more personal conversation. "You've accomplished something remarkable, Eleanor. Not just acquiring this facility, but demonstrating that age doesn't determine capacity for strategic impact." "The acquisition simply provides opportunity," I observed. "The real achievement will be sustainable transformation of care standards and operating culture. Financial transactions are momentary. System changes require persistent attention and commitment. Still, there's personal vindication in proving your children's assumptions profoundly mistaken," he suggested with knowing perspective. "Vindication was never the primary objective," I clarified. "Certainly their recognition of my capabilities and autonomy represents necessary recalibration. But the greater purpose has always been demonstrating that affordable elder care need not sacrifice dignity, a principle that benefits everyone regardless of financial resources." Robert studied me with thoughtful assessment. "You've transformed potential resentment into constructive action. Not everyone would choose that path. When faced with similar dismissal, resentment consumes energy better directed toward creation," I replied. "My children's actions, however misguided, created unexpected opportunity to address systemic failures affecting dozens of lives. That represents more meaningful legacy than merely proving individual capability." As evening settled over Pinewood Acres, soon to be renamed Horizon Gardens in reflection of our dignity-centered vision, I recognized that we stood at the beginning rather than conclusion of transformation. The acquisition provided necessary authority, but the real work involved changing deeply embedded assumptions about elder care, resident capabilities, and the balance between financial sustainability and human dignity. Tomorrow would bring detailed planning sessions for immediate safety improvements, staffing realignments, and care protocol enhancements. The following weeks would require persistent attention to implementation details, staff training, and establishing accountability structures that maintained quality standards. Beyond that stretched longer-term vision for creating a replicable model of affordable, dignified care that others might adopt. The journey from discarded resident to facility owner had been remarkably compressed, yet represented only preliminary foundation for the more significant transformation ahead, not just of a single nursing home, but potentially of approaches to elder care that recognize dignity as non-negotiable, regardless of economic constraints or conventional assumptions about capability. Tomorrow would also bring necessary conversation with my children, not focused on recrimination for past decisions, but on establishing new understanding based on demonstrated reality rather than convenient assumptions. Whether this would strengthen our relationship remained uncertain. But authentic connection could only begin from foundation of genuine recognition, rather than comforting fictions. As I prepared for sleep that final night under current ownership, I felt not triumph, but purposeful anticipation. The path ahead contained implementation challenges, potential resistance, and uncertain outcomes. Yet it offered something essential that had been missing from my early retirement years: meaningful contribution leveraging lifetime skills toward systemic improvement that extended far beyond personal comfort or vindication. The ownership transfer, completed precisely at 4:30 p.m. on Friday afternoon, culminating in a simple electronic signature exchange rather than the ceremonial handover such a significant transition might seem to warrant. I signed the final documents from Marion's office, receiving confirmation within minutes that Pinewood Acres, now legally Horizon Gardens, had transferred to Silver Horizons LLC ownership. "Congratulations," Marion said, handing me a portfolio containing copies of the executed agreements. "The facility is officially yours, with all associated responsibilities and opportunities." "The timing works perfectly," I noted, reviewing our implementation calendar. "Contractor teams arrive at 6 tomorrow morning to begin critical safety renovations. New staffing schedules activate at midnight. The nutrition consultation team begins menu redesign on Monday." Peter Harrison reviewed the financial structure one final time, confirming our operating capital allocations. "We've established separate accounts for immediate remediation, ongoing operations, and long-term improvements, exactly as you specified. The financial monitoring systems will provide daily tracking against budgeted expenditures, with compliance alerts for any deviation exceeding 15%. While Marion and Peter focused on legal and financial dimensions, my attention had already shifted to the human components of our transformation strategy. Documents and bank accounts provided necessary infrastructure, but meaningful change would emerge only through recalibration of operating culture and care practices. "The staff communication meeting is scheduled for 7 p.m., I reminded them. "This represents our first opportunity to establish new expectations and address the understandable anxiety employees are experiencing." Returning to Horizon Gardens that evening, I noted the subtle indicators of impending change already visible throughout the facility. Teams had conducted detailed inventories of equipment, supplies, and existing infrastructure. Measurement markings appeared on walls where safety improvements would begin installation the following morning. Small cameras had been placed in public areas to document before conditions for comparison against transformation milestones. Our coalition members had naturally transitioned into implementation roles aligned with their professional expertise. George supervised facility inspection documentation, Martha coordinated medication system revisions, and Helen monitored inventory processes to identify supply chain inefficiencies. Their involvement ensured that changes addressed actual resident needs rather than merely fulfilling regulatory requirements or abstract quality metrics. At precisely 7:00 p.m., I entered the dining hall where all available staff had gathered as requested. The assembled group represented every department: nursing, dietary services, housekeeping, maintenance, and administration. Their expressions ranged from apprehensive to cautiously hopeful, but all reflected the fundamental uncertainty that accompanies significant organizational change. Brenda Wilkins stood slightly apart from other staff, her typically composed demeanor visibly strained. She had been informed of the ownership transition only hours earlier through a carefully worded communication from Pinewood Healthcare Holdings' corporate office. That message had provided minimal details beyond the fact of acquisition, instructing her to maintain normal operations pending further direction from new ownership. As I approached the front of the room, murmurs rippled through the assembled staff. Many had assumed I'd left the facility permanently following the regulatory inspection. My return in this unexpected capacity created visible confusion. "Good evening," I began, allowing a moment for attention to focus. "I appreciate your attendance on short notice, particularly at shift transition when demands on your time are significant. I'll be direct. Effective today, this facility has transferred from Pinewood Healthcare Holdings to new ownership under Silver Horizons LLC. As principal investor and executive director of Silver Horizons, I'll be overseeing comprehensive transformation of operations, beginning immediately. The reaction included audible gasps and exchanged glances of disbelief. Brenda stepped forward, professional training temporarily overcoming evident shock. Ms. Parker, I don't understand. You're a resident here. How could you possibly— My resident status was genuine, though my financial circumstances differ substantially from what was assumed, I explained. I chose to experience this facility's conditions directly before implementing change, ensuring first-hand understanding of operational realities rather than relying solely on reports or brief observations. This approach, embedding within the I system I sought to transform, clearly surprised the assembled staff. Their recalibration was visible as they processed what this meant for both past interactions and future expectations. I recognize this announcement creates significant uncertainty, I continued. Let me address immediate concerns directly. First, all current positions remain secure during transition, with performance evaluations based on demonstrated commitment to dignity-centered care rather than previous metrics or practices. Second, significant facility improvements begin tomorrow morning, addressing safety concerns and quality of life enhancements identified through regulatory inspection and resident feedback. Third, new operating protocols will emphasize resident dignity, autonomy, and individualized care approaches rather than standardized processing or administrative convenience. As I outlined specific changes scheduled for immediate implementation, staff expressions gradually shifted from shock toward cautious engagement. When I described planned improvements to staffing ratios, several nurses exchanged meaningful glances, recognition that long-standing concerns about inadequate coverage might finally receive meaningful address. I understand that previous management approached operations primarily through financial constraints, I acknowledged. Our approach fundamentally differs. While maintaining financial sustainability remains essential for long-term viability, we consider dignity non-negotiable regardless of economic pressures. This requires creative problem-solving rather than automatic sacrifice of care quality when resources seem constrained. I then introduced Robert, Martha, Helen, and other coalition members who would serve as implementation coordinators during transition. These individuals bring valuable professional expertise alongside first-hand understanding of resident experiences. Their involvement ensures changes address actual needs rather than theoretical improvements. Following this introduction, I opened the floor for questions, understanding that transparent communication would prove essential for successful transition. The queries began tentatively but gradually increased in both frequency and substance, as staff recognized genuine willingness to address their concerns. Will we receive training for these new expectations? Asked a certified nursing assistant who had worked at Pinewood for 8 years. The changes sound positive, but we need to understand specifically how our approach should differ. Absolutely, I confirmed. Comprehensive training begins Tuesday, with specialized modules for each department. Meanwhile, implementation coordinators will provide guidance during initial transition days. We recognize that meaningful change requires both clear expectations and practical support. Another staff member raised concerns about scheduling disruptions during renovation. Last time they replaced flooring in the East Wing, residents were displaced for 3 days with minimal preparation. Some became severely disoriented. Renovation scheduling now prioritizes resident well-being over contractor convenience, I explained. Work sequencing has been designed specifically to minimize disruption, with dedicated staff assigned to support residents during any temporary relocations. No resident will be moved without comprehensive transition support and personal belongings accompaniment. As the session continued, I noticed Brenda standing silently at the periphery, her expression unreadable. When formal questions concluded, she approached me privately. Ms. Parker, or should I say Ms. Director now, I would appreciate clarification regarding my position during this transition. The corporate communication provided no specific guidance. Her concern was legitimate and deserved direct address. Your administrative knowledge remains valuable for continuity during initial implementation, I responded. However, long-term leadership roles will require demonstrated alignment with our dignity-centered philosophy. I suggest we schedule a private conversation tomorrow to discuss where your professional strengths might best serve this transformed organization. Brenda nodded stiffly, professional composure maintained despite evident uncertainty about her future. I'll adjust my schedule accordingly. After staff departed to resume care responsibilities, I conducted a final facility walkthrough with Robert, confirming preparation for tomorrow's renovation commencement and reviewing security protocols during construction. The quiet evening hours provided opportunity for reflection on how rapidly events had progressed from my arrival as a supposedly dependent resident to leadership of comprehensive transformation. The contractors arrive at 6 tomorrow, Robert noted as we concluded our inspection. The first phase focuses on bathroom safety improvements and hallway lighting upgrades. The construction manager requested your approval of the final work sequencing. I'll review it now, I confirmed. Also, please ensure Martha has finalized the temporary medication distribution protocol during renovation of the nurses' station. We can't risk dosing disruptions during physical improvements. As Robert departed to coordinate these final arrangements, I found myself alone in the common area, a space that would undergo substantial renovation in coming weeks to transform from institutional processing zone to genuine community gathering place. The current configuration emphasized administrative efficiency over resident comfort. Hard surface seating arranged for visual monitoring rather than meaningful interaction, inadequate lighting that discouraged reading or crafting activities, institutional colors selected for stain concealment rather than psychological well-being. My phone signaled an incoming text message from Sarah. Mom, David told me about your financial situation and the facility acquisition. I'm having trouble understanding what's happening. Can we talk tomorrow? The message reflected genuine confusion rather than defensive justification, perhaps a positive indicator regarding potential for constructive conversation. I replied, confirming availability for discussion the following afternoon, recognizing that family recalibration represented a parallel process alongside institutional transformation. Morning arrived with uncharacteristic activity throughout the facility. Construction teams established work zones with safety barriers designed to minimize disruption, while enabling efficient renovation. Staff arrived early for transition briefings, receiving updated protocols and implementation guidance from coalition coordinators. Residents observed these activities with varying degrees of curiosity, many expressing cautious optimism about promised improvements after years of institutional neglect. I had been awake since 5 a.m., reviewing implementation timelines and confirming critical path activities. Physical improvements represented the most visible transformation elements, but equally important were less obvious changes being simultaneously implemented: medication management system upgrades, nutrition, protocol revisions, dignity-centered documentation approaches, and staff communication restructuring. When Sarah arrived at 2 p.m. for our scheduled conversation, she encountered a facility in evident transition. Construction activity proceeded in controlled zones. Staff moved with purposeful direction rather than harried reaction and implementation. Coordinators provided clear guidance at transition points. Her expression registered surprise at both the scale of activity and the organized approach to managing complex change. "Mom?" she called, spotting me reviewing renovation specifications with the lead contractor near the entrance. "What is happening? Here?" I excused myself from the contractor and approached my daughter, noting her evident confusion and underlying defensiveness. Sarah had always struggled more than David with situations defying her expectations or control. Her carefully constructed life prioritized predictability and social conformance, making recent revelations particularly disruptive to her worldview. "Hello, Sarah. Thank you for coming. Would you prefer to talk here or in my temporary office?" I indicated a small conference room that had been converted to coordinate implementation activities. "Office," she replied, glancing uncomfortably at passing construction workers. "Somewhere private." Once settled in the makeshift office space, Sarah studied me with the uncertain assessment of someone encountering an unexpectedly different version of a familiar person. "David said you've purchased this entire facility, that you have millions in investments we knew nothing about, that this whole situation was some kind of test or strategy. Is that true?" Her question encapsulated both factual inquiry and deeper emotional confusion about revised understanding of her mother's identity and capabilities. Rather than addressing only the superficial questions, I recognized opportunity for more foundational recalibration. "The factual elements David shared are accurate," I confirmed. "I've maintained substantial investments for decades, resulting in financial resources that enabled acquisition of this facility when its deficiencies became apparent. However, characterizing this as a test misrepresents my intentions. This wasn't about evaluating you and David, but about addressing systematic failures in elder care standards that affect thousands of vulnerable individuals." Sarah's expression reflected struggling recalibration, attempting to reconcile this revelation with long-held assumptions about her mother's capabilities and resources. "But why didn't you tell us about your finances? Why let us believe you? Needed our help managing your affairs?" The question offered opening for essential conversation about assumptions, autonomy, and intergenerational relationships. "Perhaps we should consider what prevented you from asking direct questions about my financial situation before making significant decisions on my behalf," I suggested. Assumptions often reveal more about the assumer than the assumed. This gentle redirection visibly impacted Sarah, her defensive posture momentarily yielding to recognition of unexamined assumptions. Our conversation had begun, not with recrimination or vindication, but with invitation to more authentic understanding across generational boundaries. The transformation of Horizon Gardens had catalyzed parallel transformation of family dynamics, creating possibility for relationships based on mutual respect rather than convenient narratives. As construction sounds provided background rhythm to our conversation, I recognized that institutional renovation and relationship reconstruction shared essential elements. Both required honest assessment of existing conditions, willingness to implement fundamental change, and commitment to creating more sustainable structures aligned with core values rather than superficial appearances. The transformation had truly begun, not just of a physical facility, but of interconnected systems that determined quality of life, dignity of care, and authenticity of relationships across generations. The first month of Horizon Gardens' transformation unfolded with methodical precision. Safety renovations progressed sector by sector, minimizing disruption while addressing critical deficiencies. By the third week, all bathrooms featured appropriate grab bars, non-slip flooring, and emergency call systems that actually functioned. Hallway lighting had been completely replaced with adaptive systems that adjusted brightness according to time of day, reducing nocturnal confusion while improving visibility during active hours. More profound than these physical improvements was the evolving organizational culture. The new staffing model I had implemented immediately upon acquisition provided adequate coverage during all shifts, eliminating the dangerous understaffing that had previously characterized overnight hours. With sufficient personnel, care providers could finally spend meaningful time with residents rather than rushing through essential tasks at breakneck pace. I maintained my residence at Horizon Gardens throughout this intensive implementation. Occupying the same shared room with Mrs. Henderson while renovations progressed in phases. My continued presence as both owner and resident sent a powerful message about accountability and standards. I would not impose living conditions on others that I wasn't willing to experience myself. This morning marked a significant milestone: completion of the nutrition program overhaul. The institutional cafeteria approach had been replaced with a dignified dining experience featuring nutritionally balanced meals that actually acknowledged flavor as a legitimate consideration. Today's breakfast illustrated the transformation. Instead of lukewarm oatmeal and stale toast, residents selected from several fresh options including vegetable frittata, whole grain pancakes with real maple syrup, seasonal fruit, and freshly baked bread. "This doesn't even seem like the same place," Martha commented as we reviewed implementation progress during our morning coffee. Last month, Mr. Abrams was losing weight steadily because he couldn't manage the tough meat they served. Now he's regained 4 pounds and actually looks forward to meals. The dining transformation extends beyond just food quality, I noted. Observe how staff interact with residents during meal service. We watched as a dietary aide stopped beside Mrs. Johnson, a resident with moderate dementia who often became confused during meals. Rather than rushing her or taking over feeding, the aide sat down, making eye contact while gently orienting her to the meal. This individualized support, now standard practice rather than exceptional accommodation, exemplified our dignity-centered approach. "The staff training program is showing remarkable results," Helen added, joining our observation session. "Even employees who initially seemed resistant to change are demonstrating altered approaches." Yesterday, I observed Nurse Williams, previously one of our most efficient but impersonal medication administrators, actually sitting with Mr. Rodriguez to explain his new prescription rather than simply dispensing pills and moving to the next resident. This cultural shift had required more than just policy changes or training sessions. We had implemented a comprehensive accountability system featuring direct feedback mechanisms for residents, anonymous reporting options for staff observing dignity violations, and regular evaluation sessions that emphasized person-centered metrics rather than simply processing efficiency. Perhaps most significantly, we had revised the compensation structure to acknowledge the actual value of direct care work. Certified nursing assistants, previously paid barely above minimum wage despite performing physically and emotionally demanding labor, now received living wages with benefits. The dietary staff, housekeepers, and maintenance personnel essential to quality living environments had experienced similar compensation adjustments, acknowledging their contributions to resident well-being. "The financial model is proving sustainable," I confirmed to our coalition leadership team during our weekly implementation review. Despite increased staffing ratios and compensation adjustments, our operating margins remain positive due to reduced turnover, decreased regulatory penalty exposure, and improved resource utilization. Robert nodded appreciatively. The conventional wisdom that quality care necessitates either exorbitant rates or fiscal instability is being thoroughly debunked. We're demonstrating that dignified care and financial sustainability can coexist when operations prioritize appropriate resource allocation rather than excessive administrative layers or profit extraction. Our discussion was interrupted by Diane, the newly hired Community Engagement Coordinator. Ms. Parker, the media representative, has arrived for the scheduled tour and interview. Would you prefer to meet in the renovated community room or your office? This carefully arranged media coverage represented strategic communication rather than self-promotion. We had intentionally maintained low profile during initial implementation, focusing on substantive improvements rather than publicity. Now, with demonstrable results established, selective media engagement would help communicate alternative possibilities for affordable elder care beyond the industry's status quo. "The community room would be perfect," I confirmed. "Please ensure Ms. Rodriguez and Mr. Williams are comfortable with media presence during their art therapy session. We discussed their potential participation, but their consent remains entirely voluntary." As I prepared to meet the journalist, from senior living today, I reflected on how dramatically circumstances had evolved in just 6 weeks. The transformation of Pinewood Acres into Horizon Gardens represented more than mere rebranding. It demonstrated the feasibility of fundamental system redesign when decision-making prioritized human dignity alongside financial sustainability. The interview proceeded with thoughtful discussion of both implemented changes and ongoing challenges. I emphasized that our approach wasn't utopian or financially unrealistic, but rather demonstrated attainable improvements through recalibrated priorities and operational redesign. The conventional narrative suggests quality elder care is necessarily expensive, making dignified environments accessible only to the financially privileged, I explained to the journalist. We're demonstrating an alternative reality that affordable care can maintain dignity when operations prioritize resident well-being over administrative convenience or excessive profit margins. Your background in education rather than healthcare administration seems unusual for someone leading this kind of transformation, the reporter observed. How has that non-traditional perspective influenced your approach? Educational systems and healthcare organizations share fundamental challenges. Both must balance individualized needs with operational sustainability within resource constraints, I replied. My experience optimizing educational environments within budgetary limitations provided valuable perspective for recognizing efficiency opportunities that don't sacrifice human dignity. What I didn't share was the personal catalyst for this transformation, my children's assumption that their mother's value had diminished with age, justifying decisions that prioritized their convenience over my autonomy. That family dimension remained private, though it had profoundly informed my approach to institutional redesign. After the interview concluded and the journalist departed, I conducted my daily walking tour of the facility, observing operations directly rather than relying solely on reports or metrics. This hands-on approach had proven essential for identifying both implementation successes and emerging concerns before they became significant problems. In the East Wing, recently renovated to eliminate the institutional appearance that had previously dominated, residents gathered in conversation nooks designed for actual interaction rather than mere visual monitoring. The harsh fluorescent lighting had been replaced with adjustable systems supporting natural circadian rhythms. Institutional beige walls now featured artwork created by residents themselves through our expanded activities program. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.